Hello, this is part 2 of our DNS sessions. In the meantime, I changed the IP address of my first server, the corp server here, to a static IP address here. Here is the IP address list. We see the router has 1, the corp server 2, and the DNS server 2, which I will show you in a second, 3. The subnet mask is the same for all of those. So we have here our second DNS server where I have installed the DNS and DHCP role, and we will configure this machine here for a second DNS server because I want to show you advanced options of the Windows DNS server now. Here I will go to Properties and I won't change here anything. I go to the forward lookup zones here and say New Zone. Next. And now here I have 3 options. The primary zone is this what I created here. A secondary zone makes a read-only copy from the primary server here. And this is what we will do now. We click secondary zone and the zone name here is corp.zz as seen here. Then we click next and we add the IP address from the master server. This IP address is this here. So if there is an error, you have to allow the syncing here by the properties for your specific zone file. Here in the tab Zone Transfers, you can allow that any server can make a read-only copy, only servers listed on the Name Server tab, or only the following servers. For demo purposes, we will allow it for any server now. So we allow it here, and we will say next and finish. So you see that the syncing process here is still going on. So wait a bit. So now what you see here is a secondary zone, and here I can only do read-only things, and I can say transfer from master, and then it syncs. You can start manually syncing from this server here. So for example, if I create a new CNAME record, for example like file server, and resolve this to corp server and say OK, you have to wait for the automatical syncing interval here that you can change here. If you don't want to wait, you click here, make a right click and say transfer from master. Then it takes a few seconds to sync that. So after 1 minute, if I refresh here, I see that here is now the entry for the file server. So you see that the secondary zone make something like a read-only copy from the primary zone here. So if this server fails, you can use this as your backup DNS server. The next thing that I will show you is we do the same for the reverse lookup zone here. So I will go to the zone here, properties, and I will allow the zone transfer to any server here. Then I create a new zone, next. Also secondary zone, next. IPv4 zone, and the network ID is your IP address in the other way around, as you see. Next. Next. Finish. Now we have to wait a bit. So now are we trying to reload this here, and now we have a secondary reverse lookup zone here. This is the same as here technically. And this reverse lookup zone is a read-only thing too. So you can't do anything here. The only thing that you can do is say transfer from master if you want to sync the data here manually. Otherwise you go on the primary server to properties here, to start of authority, and here you see the refresh interval that says how often the data gets synced. Now you see here the serial number 4. I will do here a little change here and delete this record here, so that you see what happens then. Okay, nothing happened here, but maybe it takes a little while to increase here the serial number, and then the second server knows that here is something changed in the meantime, and then it syncs again. So if you want to test your backup DNS server, you can go to the network connections of your backup DNS server and set your settings here to your local machine. Say OK, OK. Check this via ipconfig all, and now you ask yourself as the backup DNS domain controller here. Now you can say nslookup corpserver.corp.zz, but you have to write it correct, obviously. And now you see that it works. Also something else like cnn.com will also work too. Yes. The next thing I would like to show you is a so-called stop zone. So herefore we go to our backup DNS server and delete this zone here and this zone here. We create a new forward lookup zone, say next. And now we go to stop zone. Stop zone creates a copy only containing the name server, the start of authority, and glue record, the A record. Say next. corp.zz, next. Next, IP address of our first server. Next, and OK. The glue record here is the A record to your associated name server here. So the corp server is also the DNS server here and the name server here. What makes sense is to go to the properties of your zone file and give your server the complete DNS name here. So it should look like. Okay. And then this points to this here. And here now you created a stop zone. So you only made a backup from here, and the data that's synced here was only the start of authority record here and the associated name server here. So you see that this is not really a full backup from here. It's another method for several usage scenarios if you have several DNS servers. We could do the same for the reverse lookup zone too. We say stop zone, next, next. Next, next. Oops. Next, finish. And now we have the stop zone here too. We could go to the properties, for example, here. And you see here the master server for this zone file here. You see that you can't change anything, and here you see the name servers too. The same is here for the reverse lookup zone, and here we could also say transfer from master to start the manual sync process here. Here you see it only copies the start of authority record and the name server record. The next thing that I would like to show you is the zone delegation. Herefore I click a right click here and say new delegation, next. And for example, I call this project.corp.zz, say next. And now I can add a name server in my environment where I say that someone else can administer and configure this subdomain from my domain here, like corp.zz. I say add here and enter the IP address of my second DNS server, for example. Okay, let's do this here. If you can't resolve your name here, like DNS server 2, for example, .corp.zz, let's try it. It can't be found. Why? Because here is no A record for this server. So I will create an A record here and say DNS server 2. and this is the IP address here. I say create a pointer record, successful, done, here. Fine. And now I can go to zone delegation again. Next, I say project.corp.zz. Next, and I enter my second DNS server here. Or I want to enter DNS server 2.corp.zz and say resolve. Sometimes, like in this example here, it doesn't work if I enter DNS server 2.corp.zz here, but it works if I enter the IP address here. If I enter the IP address, I get the message, this server with this IP address is not authoritative for the required zone. So I cancel this and I will go to properties here and go to name server, say add, and here I will enter this second server. Say resolve. If it doesn't work, I enter the IP address here. So now I've entered it here and we will try it once again here. Now at first with my IP address. And now I will try on my second server to create a new zone. Say next. And here it is a primary zone. Say next and go for project.corp.zz. Say next, next, next and finish. Then here I go right click properties and here I can say name servers and add my first one. In the best case it works with your name, corp server dot corp server dot corp dot zz. Okay, we go for the IP address now. And now we correct here the IP address of our backup DNS server. Say OK and apply here. So now this looks a bit better, except this entry here. Say yes. And allow the zone transfer to any server here for testing purposes here. Say OK. And now we will try this once again. New delegation, next. Project.corp.zz. Next. Add and now it works. In the best case it works here with the associated name too. Okay, now it doesn't, but we can go for it now here and say finish. Now I set my first DNS server, the corp server here. If there is something for project.corp.zz, please go and ask this server set here, the DNS server 2.corp.zz. And then the query goes here, and here you can do, for example, your A record. You can say your corp server. Let's do it for web server, and this is your IP address here. Create a pointer won't work because there is no reverse lookup zone here for, but now it should be possible to enter NS lookup here and go to webserver.project.corp.zz. And now it works from here, and it should also work from here. webserver.project.corp.zz. And now it works from here too. You see now the administrator of this server, in the case that you don't control both servers, can manage his or her DNS settings here on her own and doesn't have to contact you for every change for this project, for example. The next option is the so-called conditional forwarder. For this option I will create here on my second DNS server a new zone, say next, make here a primary zone, for example like google.com, go to next, next, next and finish. Now here I have google.com, I go to properties, start of authority, name servers, and here I don't allow some transfers, and here the only server is my actual DNS server, but I will change this to my real IP address here. Say OK and apply. Now you should remember that here is only the DNS server listed, and here is no zone transfer allowed. And then I will create, for example, an A record for www.google.com and go, for example, to my own server here. Say add hosts, and here is the entry. So what I have done now here is to say I'm the owner of google.com here in my network only, and I have set the www to this IP address here so that it refers to this server here. we can test this now, and you see that it works here, and here you won't see it because this is only set on this server here, and this DNS server asks himself. So I will go to the conditional forwarder now, say new conditional forwarder, and say DNS domain should be, for example, google.com. And now if a client asks this DNS server here, the corp server, my first DNS server, all DNS queries to the related domain google.com should go to this DNS server here. So I enter the IP address or the DNS server from here, for example DNS server 2.corp.zz. Okay, it's not authorized, and we will delete the IPv6 entry and say OK. Go to properties and see here that google.com gets redirected to this IP address here on this server. Now we will do the same as before, and now we will get the answers from here. Now we have said that every DNS query for google.com goes to this DNS server here. So for example, if I make a CNAME record for webserver.google.com and resolve it for the www entry, it will also work here. webserver.google.com, and it will work here too. So you see that you do not have to allow conditional forwarding, and this may make sense if you buy another big company, for example like Sony and Ericsson did that, and you have one DNS server for Ericsson and one DNS server for Sony. Then you go to the Sony server and, for example, Sony has a DNS server and Ericsson. So let's try it here. If you have, for example, Sony DNS server here and the Ericsson DNS server here, then you can say that if here is a DNS query for Ericsson, you don't want to host this zone file here, please send this to the internal DNS server from Ericsson. And if you work for Ericsson, then you refer here to the internal DNS server here to Sony. And so you can use the DNS server for a specific domain, for example from another company, if you bought them. And you don't have to ask this administrator or allow anything in your firewall or whatever. What may be necessary is a server-side VPN connection so that you can access the internal network resources from the other company. Otherwise, you won't have access to this DNS server maybe, because it's no public DNS server. The same situation can be solved through a stub zone. But if you want to use a stub zone, the other administrator of the Ericsson DNS here, for example, has to allow it. And the administrator here has, for example, to enter you here in the name server list, in the zone transfer allow list, and it's a bit more complicated. A disadvantage of the conditional forwarder is that here you enter only a static IP address, and if they change something on their network, here for example by Ericsson, then you have to edit your IP address here. If you copy their stop zone here, if you create here for example a stop zone from ericsson.com here, then if they change one IP address of their DNS servers, it gets automatically synced to your server here. And your server through the stop zone only knows which DNS server here of the Ericsson network should be asked for ericsson.com, for example. So this was our second part of the DNS implementations in the Windows Server environment. If you want to have additional information, please look into the links below this video. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next video.